Good evening. My name is Mo Degani. I'm the Chancellor here at Missouri S&T, and I'm delighted to see all of you here at the inaugural presentation of our Chancellor's Speaker Series. So thank you all for coming. We will announce the subsequent presentations and speeches as we move forward. But tonight, I'd like to introduce to you our inaugural speaker. We are delighted to have with us tonight former U.S. Senator Roy Blunt to inaugurate the Chancellor's Speaker Series at Missouri S&T. Building on a background as a public servant, university president, and teacher, Senator Roy Blunt was elected to the United States Senate in 2010 after serving 7 terms as U.S. Representative for Missouri's 7th Congressional District in Southwest Missouri and 2 terms as Missouri's Secretary of State. Senator Blunt was born in Niangua, Missouri, and grew up on a dairy farm. He is a first-generation college graduate, earning a bachelor's degree from Southwest Baptist University in Bolivar, Missouri, and later a master's degree from Missouri State University in Springfield, Missouri. Senator Blunt began his career as a high school history teacher before becoming the county clerk and chief election officer for Springfield and Greene County. He went on to serve as Missouri's Secretary of State and president of Southwest Baptist University. I came to know Senator Blunt as a champion for higher education. While a senator, he advocated for increases in the federal Pell Grant program and for funding for Missouri colleges and universities, including Missouri S&T. He also worked with Senator Sherrod Brown, a Democrat from Ohio, to craft legislation included in the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022. The act provides funding to strengthen chip manufacturing in the U.S. and bolster science and engineering research. After serving in the Senate for 12 years, Senator Blunt retired in January. He returned to his passion for history and now serves as president of the State Historical Society of Missouri. It is my honor to welcome Senator Roy Blunt.
Well, thank you all. It's great to be here. And leaving the Senate after 26 years in the Congress, the United States Senate may be the only place that at my age you could leave after you worked there for 26 years and people would say, why did you leave so early? But better that they said, I guess, why'd you leave so early than why didn't you leave earlier, which is also an option. I am glad to be here. I've been on this campus lots of times and it just gets better and better every time I'm here. It seems like in many ways the desire for the future has sort of caught up with where the University of Missouri science and technology has been for a long time. Always thinking about the future. I'm going to come back to that later. I thought I'd spend a few minutes maybe first talking about our state and the time I've been lucky enough to spend time in it. You know, my guess is that I may have spent as much time in all parts of our state as anybody who's ever been an elected official in our state. One reason is I just wanted to do that. I'm kind of quantitative, and I thought the way I learn things is by being there and seeing them. Also, I've done it for a long time, which also adds to the ability to be there more often than anybody else has been. Missouri is so unique. I think it's really where the country comes together in ways that don't happen anywhere else. You know, every state's unique. Every state has its own unique history. And I guess all of us think that our state has an exceptional part of that, but I really think we are different in how we reflect the country and how the country looks at us and we look at the country. And Missouri is really where the East and the West come together. It's where the North and the South come together. St. Louis is often described as the eastern city that's furthest west. Kansas City is more like its western counterparts than it is St. Louis. The boot heel, of course, is unique in its commitment to agriculture and the Delta traditions of the boot heel. Springfield, where I live, is really in many ways more like Tulsa or Northwest Arkansas than it is either Kansas City or St. Louis. We've been the population center of the country for 50 years now. As the country moved more west and more south, that population center line that gets announced at least once every 10 years is right where we live. And for a long time, for probably at least the last 20 years or 30 years, has been within 50 miles of right here. I think the 2020 census, it's sort of like as the country moves south and west, the population center of the country moved down Interstate 44. And the last census, Hartville, Missouri, was the center point, the population center point of America. And we reflect that in so many other ways. I didn't mention North Missouri when I was talking about the diversity of the state. I spent a lot of time in North Missouri as well, and one of my favorite observations, I can still hear the guy that was driving me that way mention in the car. He said, when we're in North Missouri near the Iowa border, I feel like we're on the top of the world. And every time I go to North Missouri, I always have that moment, by golly, I'm back right here on top of the world and glad to be. You know, no state has more neighboring states than we do, and only one state has as many states that neighbor it as we do. The coming together here is unique. We're in the middle of the biggest piece of contiguous agricultural ground in the world, the Mississippi River Valley, and it's the only thing that it has its own built-in transportation system. You want to check your geography books on this, and I want to say it exactly right, but there's more miles of navigable water in the Mississippi River Valley than the rest of the world combined. Not more miles of river water, but more miles of navigable river water than the rest of the world combined. And it's an important part of how we compete. Our rivers, our highway systems, the railway systems come together uniquely where we live. I've said a lot of times that the biggest advantage where we live is where we live. You know, location is a huge advantage to us as we look at the things that are happening in the world that I want to talk about later. But from the 17th century till right now, one of the reasons to be where we are is we had these unique abilities to move in and out and to move things around. We're at our best in Missouri when we grow things and make things and mine things and move things around. We are a very productive, hands-on kind of people and always have been. And I think we're going to benefit from the reshoring, the rethinking of how we want to really position ourselves economically. Missourians have made life-changing discoveries in agriculture and health, and you see right here things going on right now and how we produce things, how we make things. You know, while I was in the Senate, the United States Department of Agriculture moved really all of its research jobs, its ag research jobs, to Kansas City, 576 of them. They're within, each of them they're within about 3 hours of 6 land-grant universities. Makes a whole lot more sense for them to be here than on K Street or somewhere in Washington, D.C., but they are here now. When you think about research and plant scientists, there are more plant scientists within 50 miles of St. Louis than anywhere else in the world in that big a spot. And between southern Illinois and the middle of Kansas, almost all the plant scientists in the world are right there at a time when that's really going to matter. The University of Missouri, Washington University, Missouri State have been recipients for a long time of NIH grants. Missouri S&T, a big recipient of grants, and also some of those, the Chancellor and I were talking earlier this evening, some of those grants are going to be in the coming together of energy and medicine that's happening right now in unique ways and ways that it didn't happen before. List of Missouri inventors is pretty long. James Ferguson created the liquid crystal display, the LCD. Jack Kilby invented the microchip and received the Nobel Peace Prize for physics. Bill Lear created the first mass-produced business jet. George Washington Carver changed the way many crops are looked at. All Missourians. The Hubble telescope, Edwin Hubble from Webster County, was the precursor of that unbelievable telescope that's up there right now, but in ways that people were shocked by. The Hubble telescope began to think about what happens when you discover galaxies and you go beyond the Milky Way. Jack Dorsey created Twitter, now known as X, and also founded Square. Business innovators like J.C. Penney and Sam Walton and Johnny Morris through the J.C. Penney Company and Walmart and Bass Pro all found a way to do business that nobody else had found before, and then other people began to copy in significant ways. Political leaders from Missouri in so many ways have reflected the politics of the country, because our politics have generally reflected the competitive politics of the country, maybe not so much at this moment as they have during most of my political career, but whether it was Lenore Sullivan or Bill Clay, Champ Clark, Dick Gephardt, made big impact on the 19th and 20th century. No president probably had to make more decisions quicker than Harry Truman in 1945 and then throughout his entire presidency. Certainly in the last 50 years, you know, we've been really blessed with people that went from here to Washington and became part of the significant parts of the national discussion. John Danforth, Tom Eagleton, Kit Bond, Claire McCaskill, John Ashcroft, others have been, Missourians have been out there at the forefront of talking about what we should be talking about, and not always agreeing with each other, but as my wife tells me with some frequency, if we agreed all the time, one of us wouldn't be necessary. And it's always pretty clear to me which one of us she's thinking wouldn't be necessary if we agreed all the time. Let me tell you just a little bit about my fortunate and in many ways unique by today's standards opportunity to work for so many people for so long. 1972, Kit Bond was elected Missouri's governor, first Republican governor in my lifetime. And one of the maybe unanticipated opportunities that created was for Republican local officials to retire, and for the first time generally in their lifetime to know they'd be replaced by a Republican, because the governor replaces almost everybody, not every single vacancy, but most vacancies, certainly in county office would be the case. And in Greene County, Springfield, Ted Willis had been the county clerk for 26 years and pretty much began to tell his friends on election night, well, I think I know now I can leave here and leave with somebody on my side that's in charge. And so he announced that he was going to do that. Kit Bond decided that he was going to rely on local county committees on jobs like that to recommend to him who to appoint, and then he'd appoint them. So I was 23. I was teaching high school at Marshfield, Missouri. I just finished my master's degree at Missouri State University and thinking about what I was going to do next. And that vacancy became available, and actually my dad said, you ought to think about that. That's one of the most powerful jobs in the courthouse. And I thought, well, really? So I got the statute book out and see what the county clerk did and decided, well, maybe that would be fun to do. There were about 7 people that wanted to be recommended, and one of them was Kit Bond's county coordinator from the election he had just won. But somehow they decided after 3 or 4 ballots to recommend me. It was a kind of a weeks-long effort to meet the 110 people on the Greene County Central Committee and let them decide if they wanted to give this 23-year-old guy a chance to go to the courthouse and be the youngest county official in the 3rd most populous county in the state at that time. And it worked out. For the first at least year, maybe the first 2 years, my name was never mentioned with that. It was 23-year-old Roy Blunt, because it was pretty unusual to have a 23-year-old county official in a county, any county, and particularly a county that big. And kind of the administrator at that point for what was then the county court, now would be the county commission. And the county superintendent of schools' duties were in that job, and maybe publicly, most interestingly, all of the election responsibilities were in that job. So I did that, and the biggest opportunity I had there was every day at the Greene County Courthouse in Springfield, Missouri, a group of about 9 reporters would come to my office, and other offices in the courthouse as well, but there'd be a newspaper was always there. 1, if not 3 of the TV stations were there. About 6 radio stations were there. And at that time, that was the entire media. You know, there weren't all these other opportunities to find the media you wanted to find. So, you know, if you wanted to be on the radio at news at every 30 minutes and be that all day, you just need to think of something to say that would be interesting. And interesting, as it turned out, I had a lot to say. I replaced a guy who'd been there for 26 years, so almost anything I did was new. And since it was new, it was news. And then all of the deadlines and things you could work with about voter registration, and we changed lots of things, but in an appropriate way with thinking about the good job my predecessor had done. And year after year, they would sort of check who got the most local media. And it was usually either me or Mickey Owen, who was a former baseball player who was the sheriff in Greene County at the time. And it was the kind of media that I don't think is available to anybody anymore. And it gave you the chance to establish a sense of who you were in our state in what was a big, efficient market. You know, we're notoriously inefficient in our news markets, and only politicians really understand this, because you realize when you're spending a lot of money in St. Louis to convince people you'd like to work for them, you're spending a lot of that money in Illinois. And when you're spending a lot of money in Kansas City, you're spending a lot of that money somewhere else. The only fully efficient market we really have is Columbia and Jefferson City, and maybe the very small market of Kirksville, who we just, Chancellor and I were just visiting with a computer science student who's running things back behind us, who's from Kirksville. That's pretty efficient, but everything else is pretty, Springfield, pretty efficient market with lots of people. And so when it came time later to think about running for some other job, I was able to start with a sense of who I was that I don't quite know how you'd create right now. There was a time when, in the 80s, Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, became famous for the comment, "All politics are local." And I think that was largely the case at the time. And all politics were also personal, which is not as true now as it was then, where people were willing to think about voting for an individual rather than just voting for a party. I think there's been a shift where more and more, as each election seems to be more determined by big national issues rather than other issues that the people you're generally voting for are much more likely to be involved in. So in 1984, when I ran for Secretary of State, I won that election against a really good opponent, and we hadn't had a Republican Secretary of State in 52 years. So you actually, at least in all the jobs I ever ran for, I ran for the job. My sense was always, I want to work for you. Nothing wrong with I want to fight for you, but I want to fight for you occasionally is appropriate, but I want to fight every day doesn't get much done. You know, anger is an occasional tactic, but it's not a very good strategy. And sometimes I think I've had the chance to be one of the, at least in the current environment, had a chance to be, I want to work for you politician right up until the last day I was serving, as opposed to, I want to go up there and make everybody miserable because you and I think we're ill-served by the government, and I'm going to make them really sorry that I'm up there. You know, candidates that do two things, I think, have created a change in the politics of the country. And one of those things is to say, if you vote for me, I won't settle for anything less than what I'm telling you right now is what I'm going to insist we do. Well, I actually kind of wonder, what's that candidate like to live with? What do they like to go to church with? What do they like to work with? In a democracy, by definition, you never get everything you want. In fact, if you know a person who gets everything they want, my guess is you don't like them very well. And it wouldn't be very effective in a democracy. And so I'm always, are you really sure that's what you want to say? Are you really sure you want your position to be, if I don't get exactly what I want, I'd rather not have anything? Because the truth is, you're not going to get anything. Or the other approach is, I hate those guys in Washington, and if you send me up there, they'll hate me because I'm going to make them miserable every day. And all of us think that people at government at any level, particularly Washington, deserve some misery. The country feels not as well served as we deserve to be right now. But I don't know that you solve that by sending people who decide that their problem is going to be solved by making everybody else hate them. So just, you know, that is not what I had to do or was able to do. Frankly, it wouldn't have worked. If I'd have said in 1984 and again in 1988 and even in 2010 and 2016, the only reason you should vote for me is because I'm a Republican, I certainly wouldn't have won the first job. If you've never voted for a Republican in 52 years for this job, that is why you should vote for me, as opposed to, here's what I think I can do with that job if you give me a chance to do it. You know, my good fortune to work for people in our state and to be part of a state like this, in many ways kind of a test case for everything. You know, until 2008, we were like the perfect bellwether state. In 100 years, we'd voted for the winner in every presidential election but one. And in the last 40 of that 100 years, we'd voted for the winner in every presidential election by almost exactly the same margin that person won by nationally or lost by nationally. But that's not the case anymore, so we don't see nearly as much of presidential candidates as we used to. We used to see a lot of them. Because we were a competitive environment, and frankly, I think a competitive environment produces better results. Purely political environment produces results. You learn the politics of the state, and that's more important than learning the policy of the state. So, you know, we've had great public servants. Some of them are here tonight. I think generally we've been well served by state government. But I think competition in politics is a good thing, generally, and competition in everything is a good thing. And we come from a competitive place, and we're coming from a competitive place at what I think is an incredibly competitive time but a time of both great challenge and great opportunity. You know, I just mentioned we were in the middle right here of the biggest piece of contiguous agricultural ground in the world. World food demand is going to double, will have doubled between 2010 and 2060. 50 years, a 50-year period, we will have to have twice as much food as we had in 2010. Now, if you're watching the news or you watch food prices or you watch commodities right now, it's, well, everybody's taking these drugs so that they don't want to eat as much. And so maybe food companies are not a good place to invest right now. There may be some short-term truth to that. I'm not quite sure how that's all going to work out. But I do know that you can't double the population of the world and not need a lot more food. And so, you know, for us, we need to be thinking about how do we take advantage of that. It's not just production agriculture, it's production agriculture, it's food processing, it's transportation, it's insurance, it's commodity management. We're one international incident away, one food incident away from everybody wanting to know where their food was all the time. And frankly, I don't think it'll be that hard to know where every load of grain came from, where it went to, and which loaf of bread it came out in. But it'll be a whole new industry when it happens. Health research is something I had a chance to do a lot of when I was in the Congress. I had a chance the last 8 years I was there, generally to chair the committee, always to be the top Republican on the committee if I wasn't chairing it, that appropriated for education and labor and health, all of which, by the way, there are pieces right here on this campus where all of those things come together, and we often were able to find a little money here and a little money there to do what we wanted to do and what you wanted to do at Missouri S&T. But food research, plant science, health research, I think all of these things, health particularly, has changed so quickly that it's hard to even keep up with the change, recognize the change. It hasn't been that many years ago. We complain a lot about pharmaceutical cost and things like that, and there's justification for some of that. But it hadn't been that many years ago, in my lifetime, in fact, so maybe it was that many years ago then, hadn't been that many years ago when you talk to the doctor about medicine, and basically medicine, the discussion was take an aspirin or are you allergic to penicillin? There are people here nodding who remember that was basically, in terms of a prescribed medicine, that was about all there was to it. You could get a mixture of something and this and that, and a salve here and there and whatever. But we aren't that many years away from take an aspirin and are you allergic to penicillin? As it turned out, my mother was allergic to penicillin, and when she had it the first time when I was a little boy and went to the hospital for 3 weeks, she was very allergic to it. So she always said yes after that. She was allergic to penicillin. But think of all the things that have happened in healthcare. Walk through the cemetery sometime and look at how many headstones of men, again, in our lifetime, in the 60s and the 70s, in my lifetime maybe, how many of those headstones indicate that person died when they were in their late 50s or their early 60s. You know, it's just not the case anymore because so much has happened. We discovered the human genome 20 years ago, and personalized medicine became a big thing. When I first started chairing the committee that funded health research, the senator from Pennsylvania, Senator Toomey, came to me and said, I don't understand what they're doing, but there's this project at the University of Pennsylvania at Philadelphia that they tell me you ought to see, and if you'll go, I'll go with you and we'll see what they're doing. So we went. This is almost exactly 10 years ago today, and Dr. Carl June had 72 people in a study where he was trying to to change the CAR-T structure of their blood. We now call that immunotherapy, and maybe they were calling it immunotherapy then, but that was 10 years ago when there were 72 people, I believe, in the world were actually in a health study about what happens when you change your fighting back system to where you can fight back longer. You know, everybody has, with every attack on your health, you have the ability to respond, and you do, but cancer and other things then overwhelm your ability to respond. So immunotherapy, when you do that, enhances your ability to respond. And at that time, there were 72 people. There was a 10-year-old girl and a 70-year-old man. They all had leukemia, and by the time Pat Toomey and I got there for the roundtable discussion of how they were doing, they were pretty convinced that these 72 people would die from something, but none of them were likely to die from leukemia. 3 years later, immunotherapy was on the absolute checklist for every blood cancer, working on hard tumors now. In fact, remember when President Carter had a tumor about 5 years ago? Immunotherapy hadn't been really used on anybody much to speak of before. 5 years later, he's approaching 100, and he's going to die of something, but it won't be that brain tumor. So much happening so quick. Chancellor, remind me when we were talking about this again earlier, and I said, I've been saying for the last 3 or 4 years, we're very close to where in America, more people are likely to be called by their healthcare provider than they are to call their healthcare provider. The wearable patch, the watch you have on, somebody's going to call and say, you know, the thing we're watching for you it's not where we like it to be today. And that might be somebody, but it won't be your doctor. And the reason I say it might be somebody, it might be AI calling and having that conversation and having just enough information to know when they assemble what you're telling them, whether the next person that talks to you should be the registered nurse or the brain surgeon. And I think there'd be, well, engineering and healthcare, something very much is a real ongoing discussion right here, will be part of that system. Healthcare changes, I think there are going to be lots of private sector opportunities in healthcare because of that. You know, that person that calls you doesn't have to have a medical degree. Matter of fact, the hospital doesn't even have to necessarily have set up to make that happen. Telemedicine. Because of COVID, the federal government stopped resisting telemedicine. The big resistance to telemedicine was people at the federal level. It's at the group that manages the hospital and reimbursement, the Medicare and Medicaid programs called CMS. They kept saying, well, no, we don't want to make it. Sure, people could go to the doctor in a telemedicine way, but if they could go to the doctor easier, they'd go to the doctor more often, and that would cost more. Well, what they weren't thinking about, and what's kind of hard to relate to, is, but if you go to the doctor more often, you may go to the emergency room a lot less often. And you may go to the surgery center a lot less often. And what you find there is you actually save money by making it easier for people to go to the doctor. You keep people at work by making it easier to get behavioral health through telemedicine. Another area I spent a lot of time on was behavioral health. Senator Stabenow from Michigan and I, a Democrat from Michigan, worked on this. You know, we had 10 pilot states. We now have a way to move into all 50 states where mental health can be treated like all other health. Missouri was one of those pilot states. I think we had 46 locations in Missouri where anybody could go and get their mental health dealt with in an immediate kind of way. And one of their jobs was to keep track of all the other health care costs. And what every single state that's done this, states as big as New York, as small as Oklahoma, have decided is you save more money on the other health care costs than you spend on the mental health care costs In the immediate context of health care, by treating mental health like all other health, you pay for your mental health costs. We've always known, well, of course you'd save money in the long run, and of course it's the right thing to do. But if you could, and my view was, and still is, if you could make the argument successfully that in the immediate context of health care, you save more money than you, how could you say no to that? You know, NIH has said traditionally that 1 in 5 adult Americans has a diagnosable and almost always treatable behavioral health issue. The number's probably higher now. And I don't think they would argue that 1 out of 5 juvenile Americans and maybe 1 out of 5 kids in America also have that kind of same stress. Nobody that works at a college would argue with you much that this is a tough place to be if you're a kid. Not the college, but the life in America. My own personal view on this, with one of my sons is 19 and my grandchildren are all about that age too, is that this is like the most connecting thing anybody ever invented and the most isolating thing anybody ever invented. When I was a kid, if you didn't get invited to somebody's house, you usually didn't know it. And in fact, your parents told you, okay, you can invite these 3 guys over to your house for your birthday and they can stay over, but don't tell everybody else that these are the 3 kids you invited. Not only you know you didn't get invited, but often you're uninvited right in front of your face. You know, so well, you're not going with us to Beach Week, so you're no longer part of this conversation. Wow. And you know, you have I'm not sure which was worse. I think the social media and that communication probably worse than COVID and the isolation of COVID, but both really set some high standards for kids who are involved in that to now try to get over. The isolation certainly set some high standards for things like opioid abuse, which we had headed for 3 years in the right way. And then by 2020, the highest number of opioid deaths in history in our country because, you know, people were isolated, they'd lost their support system. They think, well, I could do this one more time, and they can't. As it turned out that one more time was the time that ended their life. Number 2 cause of death for everybody under 35 is suicide. Number 1 cause of death is unintended accidents, but the number 2 cause is suicide, except there is a small cohort of young men between about 14 and 19 where the number 2 cause of death is homicide. And you know, usually there's some serious dependency and other complications that come in there as well. But let me get back on the track of the things as we're going to go to questions here in a minute. The things that really would matter, health research, Alzheimer's, big challenge, but right up the road at Washington University, a lot being done. Randy Bateman, who graduated from high school at Dixon, Missouri, is really one of the principal national researchers in Alzheimer's, figured out a blood test that would tell you if you need to be worried about this. And with some significant increase in funding for research for Alzheimer's, you know, 2 drugs have been approved by the FDA in the last year that would at least slow it down. And of course, the goal is just like HIV, first drug slows it down, the second drug slows it down more, the third drug reverses it, and by the 4th drug, hopefully you have a vaccine. But that's the most expensive disease in America, by the way. Alzheimer's, about $300 billion every year, and two-thirds of it is lost income and time off, and about 100 billion is paid by the federal government, and the other 200 billion is paid by families. But we're moving in the right direction there. Alternative energy, part of that's crops, part of that's plants, part of that is small nuclear, lots of things can happen there. Geospatial, location science is going to be big, and of course this school and most of the Missouri schools on this side of the state are really involved in that as we see that big expansion in St. Louis of location science, which we traditionally had used only to keep an eye on our adversaries. But more and more you use to gather data, to check the weather, to determine where all these autonomous vehicles are going to be. Great opportunity for Missouri to be in a place where we really have the spot in St. Louis that could become the center for geospatial technology. And I say St. Louis, but S&T is one of the members of the consortium to try to figure out how we can make the most out of this in a commercial way. Food, nearshoring, reshoring, again, because of our highway system, our railroad system, our river system, this is a great place to bring jobs back to. And they won't take as many people to do what we used to do as we used to do, but all the people that do it will be paid a lot more than they used to be paid. We won't do it in the same way. And that's one reason you can afford to bring it back to America from wherever it went to try to keep the cost down. Advanced manufacturing, I heard the Chancellor mention, we introduced me to Sherrod Brown, a Democrat from Ohio, and I had worked on that legislation. We worked on another piece of legislation later to include more advanced manufacturing opportunities in the CHIPS bill that was passed last year. You know, my view of this generally, I think maybe this will be the last thing I say before we go to questions. My view of this generally is in government, the things that have a bipartisan solution last longer than the things that don't. Sherrod Brown and I were Secretaries of State together back in the 80s. He was from Ohio, I was from here. We've known each other a long time. We've agreed on exactly 5 things in 40 years. And they're all federal law. I told him in my last speech on the Senate floor, I said, you know, the way to get things done here is to find somebody on the other side to work with. You don't have to agree with them on everything. You just have to agree with them on one thing. And it's amazing how when you find one thing you agree with somebody on, and you don't have to give up. This is not a discussion about all your other values or all the things you disagree on. It's just let's find one thing we can do together. And when that happens, I guarantee you, both of you and your staff will begin to look for the second thing you can do together and say, well, that was really kind of fun getting that done and working with somebody we hadn't worked with before. Surely there's one other thing we agree with, and it's how democracy works. It's how our government works. It's how we move forward. Doesn't mean this is not a lose your principles to be able to find something to work with somebody with. It's find those things you can do together that move the country forward and you forward, and they last. You know, when the Congress changes, the first bill that the new Congress looks at to say, well, maybe we ought to undo that is not the Roy Blunt, Sherrod Brown bill. It's not the Roy Blunt, Debbie Stabenow bill. It's not the Roy Blunt, Amy Klobuchar bill. It's maybe there's some Roy Blunt bills they might look at, but they're the ones that was Roy Blunt and all the other Republicans, and those were pretty good too, or I wouldn't have voted for them. So 12,486 votes in the Congress in 26 years. Probably a couple of them, based on what I know now, could have been better. But they were all what I thought was the right thing to do based on what I knew then. And people in Missouri at the county level, at the state level, in the House and the Senate, let me do all of those things, and I am unbelievably grateful, and I'm glad to be here tonight. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Senator Blunt. I just want to remind the audience that many of you were at the groundbreaking ceremonies for our manufacturing building called Protoplex about a month ago. And we owe a significant portion of that building to the effort of Senator Blunt, who actually sent us $36 million federal dollars to make that project possible. So I want to thank Senator Blunt for that. So now our university historian, Dr. Larry Gregg, will moderate a question and answer session. So don't be shy. Send your questions forward, please.
Well, let me add my welcome to Senator Blunt. It's good to have you here this evening. We discovered we have two things in common. We're both 73 years old, and we both have an MA in history from Southwest Missouri State. He got his a year before I did, and we looked at each other and we decided we couldn't remember any class we were in together. So we were there, but we didn't meet. We have some good questions that folks have given us.
It could be where you're just both pretty forgettable then and now.
Me or you?
Both.
Both, okay. How can I, as a college student, get involved in politics and lobbying?
Politics and lobbying?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think politics are actually pretty easy to get involved in. And in terms of how to prepare for that, my answer to that has always been, if you want to be in politics, you should prepare for what you'd want to do if you weren't going to do that. That's not to suggest you wouldn't want to be in politics, but it's to suggest that you wouldn't want to have to be in politics, and that there's a great need in a democracy for people who come with all kinds of background and all kinds of information. You need maybe a lawyer or two in politics, but not too many. I'm not a lawyer is the most popular political thing I've ever said. You need a history teacher or two, but you need farmers and engineers and doctors and other healthcare providers and lots of people. So first of all, I'd say, if you want to be involved in politics as a candidate, never get to where the job is more important than the decision. Don't get in a situation where you think, I have to have this job, and I'm going to do whatever I need to do to keep it. I do think one of the benefits I had, and again, back to the media, that I was able to take advantage of and define myself, is that I never had any test of, you're going to do this or that. No, I'm going to do my best to do what I think is the right thing, and if you don't agree, you could get somebody else to do the job. But to get involved, you don't have to show up very often before people in politics think, that man or that young man or that young woman are here all the time. Every time there's a volunteer thing to do, every time there's a phone bank to be handled, they're there. You can get credibility in politics as a volunteer quicker than maybe anything else. And so that's one way to do it. And then I think the idea of lobbying and giving advice, just have to work hard to be sure you've got the information you need to give the kind of solid advice people find out they want to take. And they find out they want to take it by listening to what you advise and then see how that works out over a period of time, and not necessarily a long period of time. When I mentioned earlier where I was a 23-year-old county official, except for a couple of exceptions, the other county officials were all 53 years old, 53 years old. And I was pretty quickly included in decisions that were made there in a way that I look back at and I'm pleased about, but I'm still a little surprised about.
Thank you. What opposition is there in D.C. to comprehensive term limits, lobbyist gift regulations, and age limits?
Well, those are three big questions. Term limits, I actually was more for term limits until we had them in our state. I've decided to some extent term limits create an environment in the legislature where everybody's always thinking about, what am I going to do when this job is over, rather than I'd like this job. And I think it does empower the bureaucracy of government and maybe the lobbyists in government, because they really do have more information than you do if you've been there 2 years or 4 years. And if you spend most of that 2 years or 4 years worrying about what you're going to do next, I don't think term limits are a good thing. And the first bill I introduced in the Congress was a term limits bill. We had just, let's see, 2000. It was a big thing in our state. We had just done it. We hadn't really had the first term limits election until 2002, so more theory than fact, and I'm not a big believer there. Now, on age limits, I think people vote, people decide. I did always think, almost all the time I was in the Senate, that it would be better to leave the Senate a little too early than to stay a little too late. And I've decided generally that's not a bad life rule for almost anything. Better to leave a little early than to stay too late. But particularly in a legislative body, as opposed to maybe the White House, where one person has to make the final decision, having somebody there with substantial life experience is a good thing to have as part of that mix. So, there are members of the Senate who are 80, who are still incredibly capable, and there are members of the Senate who are 80 who aren't. And voters have to try to figure out who that is. I think is better than saying, well, you just can't serve if you're so old, or you have to take some competency test. If we started giving a competency test to elected officials, the country would have a different group of elected officials, I suspect.
Thank you. You taught at Southwest Baptist for a few years, then you became president at Southwest Baptist between 1993 and 96, and then you made a pivot in your career away from academic life to national politics. What caused that pivot?
Well, actually, the time I was at SBU was in the middle of my political life. I was the first person in my family to ever graduate from college. I'm old enough to remember both when we got the inside bathroom and when we got our first TV. They weren't exactly the same time, but not too far apart. And, rural Missouri was what it was. But I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. As I was finishing my master's degree, I was teaching high school at Marshfield, and then very quickly after that, back to that other story of going to the courthouse. So I was a county official for about a decade and a state official for about a decade. And then I went to SBU for 4 years. And I taught a class while I was there. I taught some at Drury before that in Springfield. But I taught a class at least once a year while I was at SBU. And I actually thought it would buy me more credibility with the faculty than it probably did. But it did give me a sense of the students that I might not have had otherwise. And I just taught history and government, and I'd do 1 or 2 classes a year. And I like doing that.
What have you learned about balancing your work life and family life from your career in politics?
It's a challenge. But, we did pretty well with it. And I still work with 2 of my children, my son Andy and my daughter Amy. I still work. I have since I left the Senate, or about 3 months after I left the Senate. So, okay, I will in fact go to work with you guys part of the time. And it's great. And I've always, I always involved my children, usually one at a time, in political travel and other things. So I was just spending time with them. And until, Washington's a different structure, but in Jefferson City, I always tried to be home every morning for breakfast. And when I was Secretary of State, I'd give like 250 speeches a year. And I was not home often at night, but I was always home by the end of the night. You know, middle of our state is a pretty reasonable place to get back to. And I think that helped, but it wasn't perfect. And particularly in Congress, I think sustaining the kind of friendships that you like to have is hard to do. You have lots of friends, and you have lots of, and if you're appropriate, grateful, you're grateful for what people have done. But you know, your friends at home always think you're somewhere else, and your friends in Washington always assume you're at home. And you know, the kind of sustained relationships you have when you go down to the coffee shop here every morning at 9 o'clock and have a cup of coffee with whoever's there are almost unsustainable if you're back and forth all the time. And you spend a lot of time by yourself, because you on the plane by yourself, at the airport by yourself. For 25 years, I'd say the three comments I made the most often, usually on the phone, was, I'm on the way to the airport, I'm at the airport, I'm leaving the airport. I know a lot about airports. And it's a challenge for families, it's a challenge for friendship, and I think that's unappreciated by people who, you know, I saw people, you know, you fly just like everybody else does, except taxpayers pay for it, so thank you for that. But you get on the plane 2 or 3 times a week, and people see it, well, I assume you always flew on a private plane. Well, except for the fact that I can't afford to, and I can't allow anybody to take me on a private plane. Except for that, I might fly on a private plane. But, you know, I think people assume that whatever they saw on television, on some crime show about a state senator is the way that life really is. And it's really not. Challenging for families, challenging for friends, but a great opportunity to serve. You know, if your mom and dad were dairy farmers, and you're probably never going to own the boat, but you may have a chance, if you did what I did, to feel like at least occasionally get to drive the boat. And driving the boat's more fun than owning the boat anyway. So there are definite pluses and minuses, and there are family challenges, and nobody is immune to that, I don't think.
Thank you. This question is preceded by a statement. I respect your belief in the sanctity of life and your pro-life stance. What is your opinion on abortion for women whose life will end unless the pregnancy is terminated?
I actually do have a pro-life view, but I've always been for exceptions, and I've always said what those exceptions were, and they'd be rape or incest or life of the mother. And so I guess I'd be for that woman doing what she needed to do.
Okay. Thank you. What do you fear is the biggest threat to maintaining democracy as we have known it?
Maintaining democracy. You know, on January the 6th, I was the chairman of the committee that oversees the Capitol Police. I was in charge of the inauguration that was going to happen 2 weeks later, and I'd been in charge of the inauguration 4 years before that, and it was not a good day. Fortunately, Senator Klobuchar and the Vice President and I and the 2 House members that were responsible for the count got done at 3:48 that morning, and we finished where we were supposed to finish. And before the world woke back up, at least we had done our work where we were supposed to do it. But I am not as fearful for democracy as a lot of my colleagues say they are. I've seen, I think in my mind, more challenging times than this. Vietnam, the civil rights movement, tens of thousands of people in the street, absolutely opposed to what the government was doing. And I think it's a strong country.
I think social media and lots of things create challenges for us now that are unique, but I believe we'll figure them out. It's easy now to get deeper and deeper in the corner you're inclined to be in anyway. You've listened to the news that tends to be the view of the news that you have. And most of the older people here, including the 73-year-olds, lived through a fairly unique time of news where everybody listened to the same news at the same time, and the people that was their job at least wanted everybody to believe that they were unbiased. Wasn't really like that much before World War II, where the news was pretty, you'd register as a Republican newspaper or a Democrat newspaper. You had a point of view. Everybody understood the point of view, and that's why they bought the Globe Democrat instead of the Post-Dispatch. But still, there was a level of journalism where they had a lot of space to fill, and they filled it with lots of facts. In recent years, we've fallen into a place where everybody somehow believes they have their own facts. And, the old rules of, look, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. It's hard to solve a problem if you can't agree on the facts. And I do think we have a problem trying to figure out how we collectively agree on the facts of a problem so we can solve the problem. And I'm not exactly sure how we do that, but I have a lot of confidence in the country, and I have a lot of confidence in election officials. Two of the jobs I had, the Secretary of State and the county clerk and chief election authority, people think they're much more important now than they did before 2016 and 2020, because suddenly, is somebody responsible for that? And somebody gets blamed for that if it doesn't work out right. So I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic about the economic future of the country. I'm optimistic about the democracy of the country. I'm optimistic about the talent of the country. And so I am not fearful for democracy, but democracy is not easy. Democracy is not for sissies, Democracy is tough. As Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others.
I have one quick statement, then we'll have our last question. This is a statement that reads, "No questions, just wanted to say hi. I retired from teaching 5 years ago. Thanks for supporting education." And here's the last question. What concerns does Washington have regarding AI, and is it being addressed?
What concerns does Washington have regarding AI? I was on the Intel committee for most of the time I was in the Congress, and I still am doing a couple of projects for the Director of National Intelligence, and I'm chairing the National Geospatial Advisory Council, so I have my clearance. So AI is a concern. ChatGPT is a concern. AI and machine learning are the bigger concerns. But I don't know that we could slow down our advance in those areas and hope to continue to be competitive. Certainly the Chinese aren't going to take a knee and say, well, let's stop for 6 months and think about this. And I think we're just going to have to continue to work our way through that. And I'm afraid that what will happen with AI is the same thing that's happened with trying to legislate the social media. Nobody's ever happy with it when you say, okay, we really expect you to verify the truth of the news on your social media, and we expect you to take the things off that aren't true. And everybody does always have a different view of that and freedom of speech. Haven't done very well on that. I don't think we're going to do a lot better on thinking we can control AI. But again, the free enterprise system in the country, the creativity in the country is more likely to figure out ways to put guardrails on AI than the government is. And I believe, I think AI is going to be transformative. I think it'll change the country quicker than even the iPhone did or than computers have. A lot of things are going to happen in engineering. You know, there's one view of AI that all kinds of new engineering things will be available because you can do 1 million stress tests. Well, what happens if you cantilever this over further than anybody ever has before? If you do this on the other side, to be competitive, we're going to have to be competitive in that space. And the government usually is not very successful at regulating innovation. They're pretty good at putting blocks to innovation, but I don't think that's the answer with AI.
Thank you. So please join me in thanking Senator Blunt for being here this evening.
Thank you all.